We are living through a family formation crisis, and I have the guest here today to talk about it. Not only is Stephanie Seltzer a mother of nine children, but she is a scholar studying this topic. She's studying women, what's happened to our idea of family life. Stephanie can admit marriage has fallen, cohabitation rose, yet it did not replace marriage. Stephanie comes equipped with all the data points, all the research, but she also comes equipped with common sense analysis because numbers alone can't tell us what it's like to live inside a culture that has bit by bit lost confidence in building civilization the way we have always done successfully. Stephanie's not married to any sort of ideal caricature of women from any one point in history to point to that as prescriptive for all women. I think that's what makes this conversation so accessible, so powerful. Stephanie is strong in empirical living, evidence-based research, her faith, her convictions that tell global truths about the value of family and about engaging in creative work. Stephanie doesn't see responsibility as oppression. She doesn't see family life as something sentimental and emotive and nothing beyond that. If you need a confidence boost in family life or even have concerns about having children in this world as it is, take a listen to our conversation. Join me on this episode of Rebranding Motherhood. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it. And I just want to jump right in, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Good? All right. So actually, we should set the scene because you have such a unique setup. So before we get into your research, your academic work, you are raising nine children in the state of California, which in some circles it sounds less like a family description and more like a threat to modern orders. How did your marriage and family life begin?
Back briefly a little bit. I grew up in a very religious Christian household. I had one younger brother who was 5 years younger than me, and I had a mom and a dad. My dad was military, so I grew up, I guess I was born in South Carolina. I spent some time in South Georgia, and then we moved to Japan. And then when I was a teenager, we came back to South Carolina. So mostly the South, and then a little bit Japanese. And my mom homeschooled us. She was kind of in the grassroots movement of homeschooling. It was a fairly new and innovative way to educate your children. And my mom was just on the cutting edge. And we went through the little prairie skirt stage and long hair and makeup and signed my purity contract. And I just had what I believe to be a pretty normal Christian childhood. When I was 16, I started finding out about my dad's affairs on the side, and for a long time struggled to, I guess, protect my mom and be there and keep the family together. I think as the oldest daughter, I very much felt the weight of I need to fix this. And when I can't fix it, I need to be perfect. And so I was very driven. I graduated, near the top of my class. I had a free ride scholarship to three different colleges and had my pick, and I went off and began college. And I think all the pressure of performance during my high school years really came to a head my freshman year of college because I had worked so hard to arrive, but by the time I entered college, I was just burnt out and exhausted. I very quickly lost my scholarship, and I felt lost because my whole identity up until that point in time in my life had been just the smart girl, and so much felt like it was riding on me to do well, and I wasn't doing very well. And I remember at the time my roommate was like, we should write letters to the guys that are deployed in Iraq because this would have been 2004 time period. And so, of course, I pick like all the cute ones and I start writing Christmas cards. And me and one of the guys ended up exchanging email addresses and corresponding that way, and then started talking on the phone. And by the time he was coming back to the States, I was dying to meet him. And so I called my dad and explained briefly that I had been communicating with the soldier on the internet. And so my dad was like, well, we're going to go on your first date together. And so I asked my husband now at the time, Dan, was he willing to meet with me and my father? And so we all kind of went on my first date together. Within, a couple of months, I got engaged. He deployed again. He came back. And then 6 weeks later, we got married. So I was 19 and married to a soldier and stepped away from college so I could start my new life as a wife. And I really felt like a failure with my academics, and I just didn't think I had it in me to do college. I just felt dumb, and I think I existed in that season of life for a really long time. My husband and I, he continued to deploy. He got stop lost. We had a 1 year deployment turn into 16 months. And then when he came back, we got pregnant like 2 minutes after he got off the airplane. So that kind of launched my motherhood career, and we moved around a lot. He went after he got out of the army, he began to going to college, and I watched him quite jealously as I was pregnant and had a toddler. And he very quickly finished college. He got a finance degree, and then he was able to go off on a really nice scholarship to a really good school in Boston, a private university out there. And so I remember pushing my it would have been my second I would have been pregnant with my second baby, and I would have been my oldest, who was probably 18 months at the time, and we would go sit in the grass at Harvard University and look around at all the students, and I think I really mourned that part of my life that I felt like I gave up in order to be a mother. And I kind of launched myself into just having babies. I was like, well, I found one thing I'm good at. If there's one thing about me, I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it all the way. So I kept having a baby every other year. And my husband grew his career. And he's an exceptional performer and earner, and eventually landed in San Antonio, Texas, where he started his business. And every other year he doubled the size of his business. And so it was like he was winning and I was just at home pregnant having the babies, and which I loved. I don't say that to I think there was just a lot of feelings that weren't really being articulated in our marriage, and I didn't really know who I was. I just knew that having a baby every other year felt really good. That was a great rhythm for me. When I was 29 years old, so I would have had 6 babies at that point in time. We got a phone call that my dad was living with a woman who is 7 years younger than me, and that was devastating. Everything that I believed about my family, about my marriage, about my own identity as a woman and as a wife, it just completely shattered. I had thought that if I was a good Christian girl, if I saved myself for marriage, if I had baby after baby, and I loved being at home, and I didn't try to educate myself too much, that I would be winning at the Christian woman existence. Completely, I was, for lack of a better word, I was pissed off, because the man who had told me all the truth about life was a liar, and he was running around having a great time, and I had followed his advice so meticulously that he somehow broke the contract, and it was like he was allowed to do that, but I was fully committed. And I got really angry, and I told my husband, I want to go back to school. I need an education in case you do this same thing to me. And I'm left with a bunch of babies and no education and no way to provide for them. And he was so sweet. He moved heaven and earth to get me into college immediately. Within, like, I think within 3 or 4 days, I was suddenly enrolled in college classes. And at the time, considered myself a deconstructionist, rapidly abandoning my faith. I was not going to church. I had attempted to reach out and to use women's ministry as a resource for counseling, and it just didn't meet me where I was at. It didn't give me robust enough answers, and my whole framework had just bottomed out. My whole identity was in a crisis. My faith was in a crisis. My marriage was in a crisis. I was sucking. And so I latched onto school so hard. I remember I was going to Liberty University online, and they make you take a Bible class. And my mentality was, I'm going to get that out the way because that's the lamest course ever, and I don't want to have anything to do with God right now. So we'll just hit that one up first, get it off the list, and then we can get into the good stuff. And at the end of that Bible course, which, we never got into the emotions of God. It was actually an Old Testament course. Tell me, if God can find me in an Old Testament class, then he can find you anywhere. Because at the end of studying the Old Testament in a very rational and logical way that never touched on my feelings about God, I realized that all of the things I had been deconstructing, there was nothing left, falling headlong on God and on the gospel. And I just was met there so tenderly in the midst of all of that Old Testament studies that I just thought, I can't stop taking Bible classes because maybe the church is failing me. Maybe my marriage isn't what I thought it would be. Maybe being a mother is way more complicated and harder than I could have ever imagined. And I can't imagine doing this for another 20 years, but I never want to stop studying the Bible. And that was kind of where theology and apologetics it took off for me. And I think it was because it wasn't touchy-feely. And at the time, every women's Bible study that I had gone to in a church was very emotions driven. And, like you would go to the bookstores and see the little cute books with coffee mugs and tea and plants on them. And it was like, I don't need that. I don't want God dealing with me and my heart and my female emotions right now. I just need to cerebrally understand who he is because I feel very lied to. And so I think my faith really grew on that foundation. We needed an adventure, and my husband and I kind of went crazy and we decided we're going to sell our little farm here in Texas and we're going to move to Northern California. And we're big backpackers. So that made sense culturally and politically. This seemed like the weirdest place for us to land. And but we did it. We threw the kids in the car and we moved all our stuff and we came out here. And I could have never even wrapped my mind around how different this area of the country is. And I felt like, I'm a world traveler. I've lived all over. I've met all sorts of people being a military wife and a military brat. But being outside the Bay Area and actually experiencing what it's like to live inside I guess, a people group that for generations now has grown up within that feminist framework was mind boggling for me. I mean, even in the context of just interacting with other Christian women, how they view the world here is very different than me, a traditional Southern wife and mom, had viewed it up until then. And so it was incredibly challenging. And as I began to dive into my graduate work and started really deep diving into research, and I put out a couple of research papers at that point in time and realized this was my passion and what I love doing, especially with studying women, I just began looking at the women that were surrounding me here in Northern California and being fascinated by them. And I love that God brought us here because I don't think I'd ever loved a Californian in my life. I think I had only ever heard bad things about Californians, and I didn't get it until I had kind of lived here and submersed myself in the culture. And I understood a little bit more about the family structures, their past, their political influences. I mean, it's so layered. The dynamics are just fascinating. And I knew that that was where I wanted to sit and stay for a while, was really studying the women here, especially Gen Z, the past couple of years.
I didn't realize how much of your story I actually related. I didn't finish college at first too, and decided to get a PhD in parenting, which explains why we're expecting our sixth child. Because if I was going to go in, I was going to go all in, right? And I loved it. I loved it, but very much something was missing for me, and my catalyst was through work. I asked my boss, Abby, if I could study bioethics at the University of Notre Dame over the summer a couple years ago, and it was the worst time to go. I had just found out I was pregnant with her fifth baby, thrilled, but boom, hyperemesis gravidarum hits, and it hits hard. And
Mm.
I I just had to go. Notre Dame was a tough place for me to go back to. It's a school that a lot of my family went to, and I think um, that I would have loved to have gone there, but some things were happening in my life, and that wasn't even going to be a possibility for me at that point in my academic career, certainly. And so, going back to that campus, it's a quite a long story, but basically, what happened was I went to the grotto, and this was shortly after a reversion back to Catholicism for me. I had it was the angriest time in my faith right before that, and I remember telling my husband at one point, I never want to step foot in another church again. God has been religion is a huge part of our marriage. Source, certainly, if not the source of most of our conversations, at least peripheral, at least involved in some capacity. that had always been true of our relationship, and so for me to say something like that was quite startling, and I was struggling badly, and I needed a cerebral connection. The same type of phenomenon occurred for me, certainly. So I go to Notre Dame and I start studying bioethics, and I'm wrestling with old demons, with old disappointments, with old failures, being on campus and being in that type of academic setting, especially as an Irish Catholic, right? And and so I muster up my strength. I about crawl to the grotto. So weak, and I was so sick I could barely stand. Thank God for the nuns I was studying with, because I'm very convinced it was their prayers that got me through the week. And I I remembered my legs completely shaking, kneeling at the grotto and saying, I, I, I will give it all back to you. I will give you everything I have, but I need your direction. And I returned to my laptop, and I had been doing some research in completely different programs, and not popped this opportunity at a top 25 East Coast school. And I thought, there's no way. There's no way. But somehow something combined with, I think, essay, professional resume at that point, and a lot of divine providence. I was admitted on probation at first, now I've won a top GPA in my class, and I'm completing some research, graduating this winter, and it's funny how those things change, and I never regret going and having the kids and getting married first, because there was still that longing. There was still that disappointment in myself. There was still that shame I carried about having abilities that I knew I had, and yet not having a work ethic for a lot of contributing reasons to match. And for calling my husband from campus and saying, all right, so I have an idea. I know we just found out we were pregnant 48 hours ago, but I have an idea. And he says what he always said in that moment: when God tells you to do something, you do it. So, tell me where we need to be and what we need to be doing, and we'll get you there. And I said, what about the cost in this? And he just wouldn't hear of it. So it's interesting how your life can take these turns where we tell women, you just have to be established with certain things first. And in that way, I think marriage becomes more of a capstone project. It becomes something you must, and parenthood especially, becomes something you must do after you are already established. And that list of what it means to be established gets longer and longer the more access to education and finance and amenities we have in our society. But the truth is, marriage rates have fallen dramatically. They've fallen from rates of 10.6 per 1,000 people in 1970 to 6.1 per 1,000 people in 2023. And prime age marriage has fallen from 67% to 53% since 1990. So I guess my question for you is, do you think marriage has become a capstone? Do you think that that is the biggest contributing factor to these declining marriage rates, that we need people to feel completely established instead of viewing marriage as this foundation that they build from? And what does that do to family formation overall and our outlook on that?
The meaning of marriage is changing. And it is being increasingly treated as this capstone achievement instead of a formative covenant. And when we lose the identity of marriage being a sacred covenant, it's no longer widely understood as sacred. It's no longer socially necessary even to get married. It just becomes hard to justify, why, if when the covenant language fades, how do you justify marriage? Why there's nothing sacred about it anymore. I think when it loses its sacred frame, marriage just becomes easier to delay or redefine or even avoid altogether. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. Well, and I would say too, do
Yeah.
you think modern people just wait for too much certainty? And then what do you think you do need to have figured out before you get married?
Yeah. Well, I think people, especially Gen Z women, that's where I want to stay in my lane. But Gen Z women, especially, are just increasingly feeling that marriage is something people feel like they need to qualify for economically or emotionally before entering. Um, the advantaged people are still getting married, but the less advantaged people are more likely to experience instability. And this creates two family systems. You've got stable married parenthood for the secure, and then fragile family formation for the vulnerable. If marriage becomes only for the people who are already stable, then it stops functioning as a stabilizing institution for everyone else. And okay, so yeah, I think this was one of your questions, was if cohabitation rose, why did it not simply reduce marriage numerically? And so I was trying to talk about this delayed or avoided commitment as it to contributed to reinterpretations of marriage. Okay, so how do I want to say this? I think so. There's this whole delayed adulthood and life stage hypothesis that is kind of trending right now in current scholarship, where as a researcher, we're trying to look at these disaffiliation rates among women. Because is it okay if I jump into this for a second?
I
I
would
might need
love
to give a
that.
little bit of backstory. Okay. Okay. I'm back in my lane when I can talk about how it relates to my research, but what I'm on my own. Okay, so what I've been looking at is historically speaking, young men leave the church. That's for as long as we've been making note of, who's sticking around in church and who's leaving. It's just been trending for young men to leave. And that makes a lot of sense. They want to go sow their wild oats and, they fall away, they pursue, being promiscuous. And that doesn't align with what the church teaches. But young women have had great retention rates in church, and men eventually, young men, they kind of recognize that that's probably they're not making the wisest choices, and they'll step back into church and they'll look for a wife, and that has historically worked out really well for the men. But there has been a pattern reversal, which is shocking, that I think researchers are struggling to understand. Where coming up with all of these different theories, but Gen Z women are leaving the church at higher rates than men. And this is a pattern reversal because this is the first time something like this has ever happened. And so that is absolutely piquing my interest because, first of all, as a mother, I have four daughters. I want them to stay in church. And it also resonates with me because I count myself as one of those young women who did leave the church for a time and by the grace of God returned. But I think that it just kind of dovetails so neatly into my own personal testimony, and also this desire to, I guess, educate the next generation so that we can hopefully reverse this pattern. So my ultimate desire is, well, I guess some socioculture there's a lot of different sociocultural explanations or hypotheses that are existing in scholarship right now. Clearly, there's been this influence of digital culture that is impacting young women, and there's institutional distrust among Gen Z women is huge. We're seeing this more and more where people don't have faith in these institutions, and church is one of the major institutions. And so we understand there being a falling away because of the lack of trust in institutions that previous generations would have just accepted without question. And then there's this delayed adulthood and life stage hypothesis. And this is where I think marriage and commitment very much falls into this. But we're seeing more and more, we saw the development of teenagers happen. That didn't really used to be a life stage. And then in the 50s, after the post war era, we begin to see a whole teenager life stage. Well, now we see a delayed adulthood life stage that is separate from teenagers. So after the teenager life stage, we're now having this entirely new life stage develop where you don't jump from being a teenager to an adult. You now have this whole entire delayed adulthood life stage. And I think that's where we see young people not committing to marriage, living with multiple partners in these different arrangements, and kind of test driving marriage before making the commitments because they don't view themselves as financially stable enough or emotionally strong enough yet to handle the commitment or the institution of marriage. And then, of course, we see these shifting moral and sexual ethics happening among this demographic as well. So all of these are hypotheses or reasons that they might be affecting the retention rates of young women. All of these sociocultural explanations are just some of the reasons that we get into with my research for trying to figure out why are Gen Z women leaving the church in record number.
It's so reinforced by Hollywood. You see it since the early 2000s especially, but you can go all the way back to the 90s, I would say, starting with probably shows like My So-Called Life, moving on to the OC in the early 2000s. Pretty Little Liars was closer to the twins. There is this aggrandizement of teenage youth with adult amenities and very critically low accountability from adults in these kids' lives. And so what you're seeing there is this enhancement of, or this, I would say, how would I phrase that? This valuing of youth without responsibility, of fertility divorced from responsibility, and, the age of the it girl, right? But the age of the it girl taking on a completely new meaning where this it girl spanning from the 90s to at least, the 2010s, we can say in the height of these after school TV shows, was this overt sexuality, overt sexual behavior, and yet no expectation of ownership or institutional engagement. And so when we look at that, we're seeing, okay, so that type of female is so propped up. And then you look at the adults in these shows and they're kind of bumbling idiots, or they're abject failures in a lot of their personal lives. A lot of their parents are undesirable in one way or another. And they've lost their appeal. And so it's really the focus being on the teenagers, and then the parents are very much scripted as these parties who have to give them a pass on everything. Any sort of deviant social behavior, they have to give them a pass on this because there's some unnamed pressure on American teenagers that we all must accommodate, because stress had become the enemy in this character development. And so we have to really understand these kids. We have to give them a ton of space and a ton of privacy, and they're of course entitled to that. They're also simultaneously entitled to all the amenities in the world without any sort of work component, any sort of, like we said, institutional engagement. So it's kind of a socialist ideal. These
Yeah.
kids, zero responsibility, zero individual duty, and yet access to all of the fruits of capitalism. That really, in my opinion, is the queen baby persona that these television shows, the Gossip Girls, they all produce, that wealth without accountability, no responsibility, certain dereliction of duty, and they run around like absolute hooligans, and yet things always tend to work out for them because there exists this paternal and maternal safety net that they're simultaneously not accountable to. You look at that and how much that contributed to, I'm a millennial, to my generation growing up. I was the height of Gossip Girl, right? I was the height of the OC. And I mean, that was my outlook on social desirability. Thank God I grew up in a religious home. So my sister was having kids and teaching me about that responsibility as I was also in high school. Thank God my parents had my grandmother live with us. So I had well-rounded perspective in an intergenerational household. But certainly we've very much allowed that messaging to run prevalent in our culture. And it's very funny because I do see, and I think you're seeing this too, and Gen Z, there is also simultaneously parallel to the ones that are leaving church are the ones that are going back or going in the first time in droves. Are you
Mhm.
also seeing that in your research?
And what we're seeing when you're talking about those TV shows, what we forget about is a scripted framework that they can manipulate to appear coherent. And actually, we grew up really being parented by these TV shows. And it's fascinating because I bought into that on some level and didn't even realize it that I myself was operating in this feminist framework. And then when it wasn't coherent in reality in my own lived actual experiences, that was shocking to me. So I think, hold on, let's see. If feminism is framed primarily as a response to institutional injustice, then women's disaffiliation from the church may be interpreted as a protest. However, if feminism is situated within a broader shift in moral and epistemological authority, then disaffiliation may reflect deeper changes in how truth, gender, and religious authority are evaluated. We forget that how we're viewing the world is through these different interpretive frameworks. And when you start operating in one that tries to force a feminist framework as something coherent, it just doesn't work. And I think getting back to my own personal testimony and me really bottoming out was I had been constructing all these different webs of meaning in my life and attempting to, almost like a spider, a spider on a spider web, trying to zoom around on these different webs. But there were cross pressures because I was trying to live a biblical interpretation of reality and have a biblical worldview, but I was also allowing feminist worldview to create some interpretations of reality as well. And where those two would intersect would create these cross pressures. And so on one hand, it was like, I need to be an educated, woman with a career, and I shouldn't have gotten married so early in life, and I shouldn't have saved my purity for marriage. I should have gone out and had fun like a man. But then on the other hand, it was like, I identify as a believer, and this is truth as expressed through Scripture, and I believe that if I operate, you know, faith based off of these truths, and I'll have a pretty good life. What I didn't realize was that those two different frameworks were going to create these cross pressures in my life. That when God applied a little bit of pressure and started testing me, I they just started breaking one after the other, and I completely bottomed out. And so I really needed to take my faith and own it for myself. And instead of allowing this feminist framework to speak into my reality, I needed to solely build my life on the truth, or else I was just going to keep bottoming out again and again. And it was only when I realized that I think God did give me the gift of that education, but not just knowledge, like true wisdom. And that only comes from Him.
Your framework competes with your convictions. And so it becomes this type of chimeric being that's wholly incompatible. So what you're receiving from the culture and what you're starting to internalize, and even some longings you have for, say, education and these intellectual pursuits and how do I make all of this work, it's very difficult to be at the same time operating under a sort of framework that you know will implode as you're trying to also live on conviction. So this is what I see a lot in leftist circles. We look into mythology, we look at these chimeric beasts, right? That you can sell yourself into thinking that you can create a creature so majestic. It's the body of a lion, it's the wings of a dragon, it's the head of a serpent. It's all of these pieces that if I could just overtake creation and I could just fashion myself a being, I will accomplish what I need to bridge what is ultimately incompatible in my life. And so we see, like, you look at Frankenstein. Seemingly the creature is just pulled together from the limbs and the parts of men, but there's no breath of life, right? So there's it's just animation, and the horrible tragic emptiness that the creature feels. He knows there's none like him. And he knows that he cannot walk the earth and feel truly connected. And so I think sometimes that can be a source of great loneliness, is to continue to try to walk down a path that is laid for us while our convictions absolutely differ from that framework. And so that can be really difficult in a lot of ways, because then you think, okay, I've got to totally throw that playbook out and I've got to go full fundamentalist. And then you don't find yourself there either. And then you're like, that wasn't the idea of womanhood I had envisioned. And so that, and I think especially in our age of everything's digitized, everything's media at this point. So you receive a lot of commercialized ideas, caricatures, if you will, of the idea of womanhood and the idea of what it means to be a mother. And it seems like you kind of receive a lot of protest from all angles, no matter what your choices are. So
I think the church's response to all of this is just the sense of sort of nostalgia where, well, what is womanhood? Well, it's just this 1950s ideal woman, that she stays at home and she cleans her house and has children. And that's beautiful, but I think womanhood is so much deeper and more than that. And I think the Bible actually provides us with a coherent view of womanhood that's robust enough to transcend the generations. And so we're not looking back to any one generation and saying, "Oh, they definitely had it. They were nailing it. They were absolutely nailing womanhood properly in 1955." That's not the case. And so I think that alone like offers women so much hope, because we're not trying to recreate a sense of womanhood that's based off of nostalgia and something that we once had in the past that's fleeting, but we can be a woman in this current cultural context and be fully an expression and the embodiment of femalehood as God intended here and now in this generation. And that to me is really exciting.
it's no secret that in our generation of the challenges we face as mothers is this anti-natalist perspective on having children. And I think you probably have a bit of a unique perspective having 9 children in such an interesting area. But this is a national issue. Do you, do you think women are being told the truth about what children cost, what they give? What do you think is the biggest lie women are being told, especially about big families?
Think the biggest lie is that we're being taught that there's some sort of economic entry fee to motherhood or even to marriage, that the price of entry is so much higher. Housing, debt, stable work, or the expectation of complete self establishment before you venture off into motherhood, that all of these things need to be accomplished and kind of checked off the list first. People worry that they couldn't afford marriage or children or even living in a one income season of life. But economics alone can't explain the loss of desire for permanence. And so, I mean, you and I both have felt that desire clearly with you expecting your six and me having 9 children, that you can't explain it away or take it away the very much real feelings that accompany being a woman, which is this desire to create. And being told that we have to limit that as a woman, like, I don't want to exist in a framework that tells me no. That just doesn't work for me. So I the desire to create, I believe, is a God-given desire that God's given every woman, and the biggest form of self-expression is through children, the coolest thing I've ever made.
And I do. I agree that the fertility conversation is reduced. It's highly reductive to cost. Cost is real. Housing is real. Healthcare is real. Education is real. I understand.
Absolutely.
But I'm interested in whether fear and imagination play a larger role in the being adversarial to having children before there's that kind of capstone idea we talked about before I've arrived at certain brackets. Women's labor force petition peaked around 60% in 1999. It still hovers in the upper 50s. So a two earner household is very normal now. But has family life actually adapted to that? Or are so many couples just negotiating from exhaustion? You know, in your own marriage and household, what makes family life feel rightly ordered instead of just constantly score kept?
I would say that so has family life adapted to the two earner norm? I wouldn't say that family life has adapted to the two earner norm. I think we dismantled older expectations faster than we built stable replacements. I don't want to reduce this to women either working or not working. That's not what the conversation's about. But modern couples are expected to maximize income, parenting, emotional intimacy, self fulfillment, and household management all at once. That's overwhelming. And this just creates exhaustion and permanent negotiation. And many marriages now are just operating under this permanent negotiation rather than shared assumptions. So when couples are getting married, they're very much approaching it as like a business transaction, going into it with these shared assumptions about marriage and togetherness and family and meaning and transcendence. So much as they're just like, okay, I'm going to handle this and you handle that. And this is how the finances are going to be split 50-50, and the childcare is going to look like this. That's exhausting. And so people, let's see, so the constraints are layered. Costs do matter. Housing, childcare, healthcare, education, all of those costs do matter. Timing matters as well. Delayed marriage compresses childbearing years. We are seeing more and more of women our age realizing that those childbearing years are running low, and they better do it now or never. Location.
Economic fears aside, all those anxieties that can be dealt with that are truly temporal, something that is existential in women who may be nervous about entering into motherhood is they're viewing it very often because very marketed to them this way as a loss of self rather than a stepping into duty. How would you advise them?
Yeah, I think that what you have to remember is that you're operating in a framework that very much teaches young women that. More and more that young women, they are lacking are the critical thinking skills necessary to stop and take that statement. Is this truly a loss of self? Is motherhood not a meaningful vocation? Where did I learn that narrative? Where did that come from? Who taught me that? And to really evaluate and challenge these secular narratives, because at the end of the day, that's a narrative, and that's not. truth.
I see this often where women are under some sort of perception that they're being defiled by motherhood, that they're being defiled by duty, that they're somehow tied down, that the children become the proverbial ball and chain. We've pushed children into a very limited portion of society. And there's obviously millions of families operating in this very family centered, family oriented dynamic where they take the baby with them. They exist in multitudes, mothers do. And I think that can be very difficult for a woman who has never seen or maybe never even envisioned herself truly as a mother in any sort of dynamic way. I think it's so easy to flatten ourselves against the expectations associated with the calling rather than see the infinite potential in it. According to your research, what makes families sturdier? What does a family need to continue to move towards a place of strength?
Think stability depends on commitment, community support, and a shared moral framework. I don't want to speak, I want to be really careful here because I think there's a lot of moms who are possibly single moms who could be listening to this and they're like, oh, great, well, I'm screwed, because I'm over here just trying to raise a child on my own. So I want to be really careful. I'm not like, oh, you have to be in a two-parent household. No, it's the stability that matters. And so I do want to highlight that. And that marriage isn't magic, but it does bind adults into obligations that children deeply need. So, children need durable adults, not merely biological ties. And so, when they do have the luxury of having both a mom and a dad, it's important that mom and dad aren't operating and their relationship isn't basically consists of negotiations, but true love and acts of service and love to one another. And that's going to look differently, like you shared, where you called your husband, you're like, hey, I have an idea, and he makes it happen. And my husband and I both have pulled crazy stunts like that on each other and helped pursue one another's dreams and passions. And sometimes it's his for a season, and other times it's mine. And I pulled those same stunts on my husband. And at different times in our marriage, there's been different seasons where he's been helping me pursue and make my passion a reality. And I've been able to pursue and help him in his passions. And so, what our children, I hope, are seeing at the end of this as two adults who were imperfect, but who loved each other very much and were both willing to sacrifice and to serve one another. We weren't sitting here making negotiations and exhausting ourselves at the end of the day because we're too busy going tit for tat, but just as each had the opportunity to love and to pour into one another, we were able to do that. And that's what makes a good marriage, a good lifelong commitment work. And so, yeah.
Absolutely. I do think it's more camaraderie than it is negotiation very often. It is not that technical. If the relationship's doing well, then you're not going to want to go tit for tat with each other. For the woman listening who wants children, but or wants another child, but feels intimidated, what would you say to her?
Mm, I cannot tell you how many times I've looked at a positive test and completely freaked out. I also have the most debilitating morning sickness. I know that there's weeks where my family is going to have to help pick up my slack because I'm incapable of really doing much else than run to the toilet. And so, and that sounds like such an awful thing to sign up for. But as someone who has done this repeatedly to herself over and over again, I have to say it's been the sweetest part of my life is to hold the wonder of each new human that I've brought onto this earth with the help of God, and to look into their eyes and think, this is a person, this is a soul, and just the joy that each of my children have brought me. My life is hard, big, it's nonlinear, it's complex, and the fact that I have 9 beautiful souls to help lighten that and to make it wonderful and magical and special is like the greatest joy. Can't imagine getting through my life without all 9 of them. And so I would just encourage any woman listening who's thinking, oh, well, it's going to cost X amount of dollars, or we would have to make our life look this way. Trust me, at the end of the day, it's just another plate at the table, but it's a whole life you get to enjoy. And one of the wonderful parts about operating under a coherent biblical framework is that when you act out in obedience to God and you embrace each life that He gives you, He makes a way. And I watched Him do it. We were on WIC when we first started out our family. We had one child, and I remember getting my WIC coupon and getting 2 gallons of milk and a block of cheese and some juice and putting it in the refrigerator and just opening the door and staring at it and being like, my fridge has never looked so full. I love being pregnant because we have food. And now, my husband, because of the pressure to provide, it's forced him to advance in his career, and we also never put the onus on my husband to provide. He shows up and he does the work, but God truly meets him, and I've watched the Lord just grow our business with each child. I mean, if you could chart it out on a graph, it's wild because he's a smart guy, but he's not that smart. Make it make sense. But God is so richly provided for our family. And even on, we've only ever been one income. I've never, when I found out I was pregnant and I got sick the first time, I walked away from working and I've never gone back to work. So we've only ever existed as a one income family. And that was so terrifying to us, especially when we got pregnant with twins and we jumped from 3 to 5 kids very quickly, and we just logistically, the finances weren't gonna make sense, and, we started praying, "Should I go back to work? Should I do this?" And then watching God just miraculously provide, truly, that wasn't my husband's work. That was just my husband being faithful in his work and then God showing up and doing the rest. It's so much easier almost to say this now as a family of 11 because we're so far away from the boat and walking on the water with our eyes on Jesus that we're going to sink if we falter in our faith right now because we could go under so freaking fast with this many people and that trust that God's established where I know no matter what we've got our family here, like we're all here and we're doing it together, and I'm not, that fear doesn't exist the way it did when I only had 2 or 3 kids. And so I would just encourage women to know that that fear is a season. Grow through it because you're not always going to be existing in that state of fear. Not saying that you won't have the fear or that it won't pop its head throughout your life, but you're bigger than that fear.
You play high stakes games, and yet your faith increases exponentially, and so your fear decreases. It seems counterintuitive, but it's only through the experiences you said of stepping out of the boat that you experience God's provision. That seed of doubt in you is challenged. And as
Yeah,
parents, it
for
must be
sure.
challenged regularly. Built in to who we are. I mean, I know this being pregnant right now, that anxiety is physiological. It arrives because it's indicating that we we have taken on the very serious task and we are responsible for this task. And yet the spirit aids what is happening physiologically. And you have a place to place your anxiety, cast your anxieties onto him because he cares for you. Doesn't mean the anxieties will cease to exist. It means you have a place to put them uh, that will in turn provide um, an incredible meaning for your life. And so it is duty, but it is not without provision, and it is effort that is not just thrown into the air with no return. It is for a purpose. So, Stephanie, thank you so much for talking with us today. We have to get you back on again for other episodes. There are so many topics that we touched on today that I think we could create entire discussions around. So, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
On Rebranding Motherhood, we talk about the lie that motherhood is a trap, and that if you are in a situation where you need support, then no one will be there to help you or to be a steady voice for you. I want to talk to you about our project Loveline that decimates that lie and helps women get real help in real time. We connect women with resources, or if we can't find one, we become the resource. So if you, someone you know, needs to access our hotline, you can visit us at loveline.com. And if you want to volunteer, if you want to be that steady voice in someone's life, we would love to talk to you about your heart for helping mothers. Thank you.